Saleh would attempt to crack down on the movement, driving the Houthis into the northern mountains. Squeezed between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, the Houthis began to move closer to other Shia factions in the Middle East, ultimately courting the support of Iran and its axis of resistance. With the outbreak of the Yemeni revolution in 2011, local hostilities evolved into a front in the wider Iranian-Saudi proxy war. As the revolution collapsed into a civil war, the Houthis skillfully navigated Yemen's internal dynamics. They partnered with the then-deposed Saleh to take the capital, Sana'a, by February 2015. Having seized power once more, Saleh turned on the Houthis. By this stage, however, Houthi agents had infiltrated Saleh's forces. After a brief struggle, the Houthis deposed Saleh and took over the army. Overnight, the ragtag rebel movement came into possession of the military and demographic wealth of North Yemen. More importantly, however, the Houthis had broken out of their confinement and gained a coastline. Consequently, the group came to possess a valuable geopolitical position just across the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. At about 30 kilometers wide, at its narrowest point, the Bab al-Mandeb is a vulnerable gateway for shipping and an opportunity for pirates, the ranks of which the Houthis rushed to join. Access to the ocean allowed the Houthis to establish new supply lines and engage in the arms trade abroad. Thus, even as the Houthis later lost the port city of Aden, revenues from maritime-related activities and piracy remained high, surpassing $1.5 billion by 2020. The viability of the Houthis provoked fear in Riyadh, and in 2015, Saudi Arabia led a direct intervention in the conflict. Under the fog of war, the Houthi insurgency sustained itself and even advanced owing to the inflow of aid and materials from sponsors in Tehran and Beirut. Years of the Saudi-led air campaign had taught the Houthis the value of force dispersal and asymmetric warfare. Through capturing several of Yemen's ports, the Houthis came into possession of the defunct Yemeni Navy's anti-ship missiles and limpet mines. But with Iranian assistance, such technologies were reverse-engineered into viable and deadly weapons. By 2022, the growing fleet of explosive boats was complemented by the delivery of a host of anti-ship rockets from Iran. These include the 120-kilometer ranged Noor and the 200-kilometer ranged Qadir anti-ship missiles, as well as the 300-kilometer ranged Khalij Fars anti-ship ballistic missile. Loitering munitions, such as the Samad 3 drone and the Tofan 3 blowfish, have likewise gradually found their way into the Houthi arsenal. The deployment of these weapons is believed to be coordinated by the Iranian intelligence cell on board the MV Behshad, which is a commercial cargo vessel that is used covertly for reconnaissance and intelligence operations in the Arabian Sea. As such, over time, fighting the Houthis became expensive, too expensive. By 2021, the Saudis signaled their intention to withdraw. The Houthis that emerged from the years of war were unrecognizable from the organization that had marched on Sana'a in 2015. As a truce was negotiated with Saudi Arabia, the Houthis sought to shore up their domestic and international standing. The outbreak of hostilities between Israel and Gaza provided that opportunity. By attaching its actions to a wider political narrative, the Houthis were able to re-engage in piracy politically cost-free. War had made the Houthis, and now the Houthis were poised to make war. In July of 2002, the US Navy conducted a war game known as the Millennium Challenge. Focused on a hypothetical war between the United States and Iran, the war game was notable in that it demonstrated the top-heavy US Navy's unpreparedness to defend against an asymmetrical threat. Throughout the war game, the team representing Iran dispersed their forces and utilized analog technologies such as motorcycle messengers and light signals to avoid detection. In combating the US Navy, the Iranian team employed fleets of waterborne, improvised explosive devices simultaneously with massive salvos of cruise missiles. The strategies employed by the Iranian team resulted in the deaths of an estimated 20,000 sailors and the destruction of 16 warships, 1 aircraft carrier, 10 cruisers, and 5 amphibious ships. 2 decades later, and the US Navy is confronted by a similar threat profile. Whilst the Houthis do not possess the same capabilities of a besieged Iranian state, the US Navy is similarly restricted due to wider geopolitical considerations. With tensions increasing in the South China Sea, Washington cannot afford to relocate its forces westwards. Resources are scarce. Such considerations also limit other aspects of American engagement. Between the ongoing Ukrainian war and the evolving hotspots in South America and the Middle East, American diplomatic and intelligence assets are stretched thinly. Where force can be applied, it is limited by the costs of deployment, which is not always measured in dollars. Since America is the chief global naval power, the US Navy must maintain a presence worldwide. Political disruptions force Washington to redeploy its forces away from one region to the next, yet in doing so, it downgrades its threat response in the affected region. In the case of Yemen, Washington has already had to make such concessions, deciding to pull the USS Theodore Roosevelt carrier out of the South China Sea during a serious escalation of tensions between China and the Philippines. By deploying the carrier to the west, Washington incurs the strategic cost of one less carrier in the east. Another problem with modern warships is that they're pricey and designed for combating other conventional warships. They're not made for asymmetric warfare, and so no one wants to risk damaging their assets to an unsophisticated attack. It doesn't look good for the press. Ergo, warships are like poker chips. You don't use them unless you're willing to lose them. For instance, each Arleigh Burke-class destroyer deployed by the United States costs $2 billion to build and another $7 million to operate monthly. As for repair costs, these can be in the hundreds of millions, even if the damage is quite low. Take the case of the USS Cole bombing in the year 2000. Al-Qaeda built an explosive boat that cost less than $1 million. Yet it was able to cause $240 million worth of damage and take the lives of 17 sailors. This economic logic also functions in the inverse. Each missile launched by the US Navy has cost taxpayers between $1 and $4.3 million. When these types of missiles are used to take out budget drones worth $2,000, it is the cost equivalent of using a bazooka to kill a fly. In such cases, it is hard to ascertain who killed who. Not surprisingly, the total cost of Operation Prosperity Guardian, according to Al Jazeera, has amounted to $1.8 and $4 billion. These are not rookie numbers, and American taxpayers will consider such expenses as they go to the polls in November. The legacy of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan has left the American electorate with little appetite for foreign wars, particularly not wars that necessitate deep commitments, such as Israel's war in Gaza and its associated spillover. The nature of this conflict has also deprived Washington of relying on its traditional strategy of coalition building. Due to the intense controversy in Gaza, none of the Middle Eastern powers are willing to get directly involved. That leaves only the European powers, which are not much of help. The European Task Force, Operation Aspides, has totally different rules of engagement. For one, its mandate discourages direct strikes on Yemeni soil and instead limits European involvement to escorting operations. Yet, in deploying a naval mission apart from the US, the European navies face a dual crisis of capability and confidence. Simply put, the European fleet lacks the number of ships necessary to defend against the Houthis because it doesn't have the proper mission to start with. Even where such ships can be gathered, the absence of a unified EU command structure, as well as the lack of communication with the American-British mission, has been disastrous. Faced with such difficulties, it is no surprise that both operations have proven to be ineffective. The ineptitude of the US Navy has emboldened the Houthis, who have scaled up their attacks in recent months. For comparison, between January 2017 and June 2021, the Houthis performed 24 maritime drone attacks, on average one every 70 days. However, from November 2023 to July 2024, they have performed 77, on average one every 3 days. Such havoc has not been lost on insurers, who have increased premiums substantially. Costs are extrapolated along the supply chain, with each diversion around the Cape of Good Hope increasing the duration of shipping by 10 days. In global trade, every day added is accounted for in costs associated with fuel, crew salaries, and insurance premiums. So, logistics get expensive really fast. Lacking a military solution, Washington is increasingly forced to pursue a just as unpalatable diplomatic solution. But this disengaged policy only bolsters the prestige of the Houthis. Still, even in an unpalatable situation, there are choices between bad and worse. A few strategies are worth considering. On the one hand, Washington could resort to strengthening the official Yemeni government in Aden, which is unpopular, underfunded, and considered as illegitimate as the Houthis, given its reputation for incompetence, corruption, and infighting. A clear alternative to the Houthi insurgency must be shown to the Yemeni public so that they can decide what kind of country they want for themselves. America can count on decades of experience from Afghanistan in what works and doesn't, including the appropriate levels of funding, foreign involvement, political processes, and autonomous organic growth. On the other hand, a concerted UN effort will be necessary to enact change. Russia and China can sometimes act as spoilers in the Security Council, but this does not mean that they are immune to the Houthis' actions. In addition to direct and indirect economic costs, both are sensitive to Saudi Arabia's needs and may be persuaded to pressure Iran and the Houthis to subtly back down. America would likely need to make geopolitical concessions elsewhere to get the Russians and Chinese talking. However, saving the Red Sea might not justify sacrificing Ukraine and Taiwan, which is what Russia and China would undoubtedly bring up. So, back-channel diplomacy would probably not work. Lastly, if America is to stop the Houthis, it could try to bring about a reasonable end to the hostilities in Gaza. Robbing the Houthis of this justification for their actions in the Red Sea would be a powerful incentive to make them sit down at the negotiating table and abandon behavior that they have hitherto benefited from. Admittedly, settling any deal that crosses Israel's interests would result in political backlash for the executive office, so this might not work either. By all accounts, Washington has inadvertently become a hostage to contemporary international relations. There is no immediate resolution in sight that is both practical and politically redeemable. It is unable to stop the Houthis by military means, just as it is unable to stop them by diplomatic means. Meanwhile, for the destitute Houthis, now is their window of opportunity. Every time they open fire, they are ringing the dinner bell, so they might as well make it count. I've been your host Shivan from Caspian Report. Thank you for your time, and salam.